Welcome to the Kuyperian Commentary Podcast. This is episode 124, and we're here to talk to Uri Brito about his new book he just published. If you're like me, when you were a kid in Sunday school, you talked about the armor of God, and you got the little coloring sheet with the Roman soldier on it, pointing out all the different parts of the Roman soldier's armor, because clearly Paul was sitting under house arrest in Rome, looking at the Roman soldiers, trying to think of good object lessons for Christians that he was writing to. In his book on the armor of God, The War of the Priesthood, Uri says that's wrong. So Uri, why is the coloring sheet the wrong picture of the armor of God?
Well, this is one of those great cases where the answer, Jesus, is actually the right one in Sunday school, not the Roman soldier. And I wish that would be a more prevailing theme. And I think when you look at modern commentaries on this issue here, there's a sense in which a lot of interpretations on Ephesians 6 becomes very much focused on the immediacy. So because Ephesus is located in that general part of the world, it just makes sense to see the Roman Empire as the central motif of Paul's development. But we need to really go behind the veil and see what's really there. And for the Apostle Paul, when the veil is open, what you do see is just this entire Hebraic fabric of literature, as opposed to a Greco-Roman fabric. Not that Paul is disinterested in tackling issues regarding the Greek world. He does this obviously in we see this in the book of Acts pretty significantly. But what Paul is very much interested in is in this epiphany world of Ephesians, in this post-incarnation world, in this post-baptism world, when the message is going far into the Gentiles and when the walls of partitions are breaking down. Paul wants the Gentile world to see that they're rooted in a Jewish world. And so when we talk about the armor of God, Paul wants to communicate the lineage of the Messiah, that the Messiah does come from a Jewish lineage, but not only that, more particularly, he comes from a priestly lineage. And that priestly motif is the thing that guides the Apostle Paul throughout his writings. And so Ephesians is kind of structured in many ways in a priestly outline, and it concludes with begins first and foremost with the apostles sort of giving these introductory remarks to a people who have been called and chosen by God. And it ends with a form of a commissioning, kind of what we see in a covenant renewal worship, Rick. It begins with a call and ends with a commissioning. Go forth now into the world with this equipment, with this armory here that can only make sense in a Christo-priestly world. Not in a Roman world, because the Roman world is not interested in the covenant,
right?
But the priestly world that Paul is familiar with embodies this entire motif.
So what's the likelihood, because Paul was largely rejected at the synagogue in Ephesus, went and set up in the lecture hall of Tyrannus and taught the Gentiles, what's the likelihood his Gentile readers at Ephesus are going to understand the priestly Old Testament connection versus what they see around them in their culture every day?
The Pauline perspective throughout the Bible, throughout his writings and his letters, is always countercultural. And so the Apostle Paul is very much self-aware that the message he brings forth are going to be not only countercultural, but counter-empire.
Mm-hmm.
And so that Paul is the anti-empire. And so what's being offered there are two fundamentally different coverings and garments. And what Paul is saying, that you can take the covering of the Roman Empire with all its force, but with all its finesse in terms of their armies. They are fit for war. They have a victorious history. They are conquerors in many ways. But what Paul is offering is an alternative covering, a covering that does not come through the gifts of men, but an offering that comes from an alternative kingdom, a different empire, we might say. And Paul is telling these Gentile readers, this Gentile context, that the covering that comes from heaven is going to confront the covering that you're most familiar with. So in an environment where what you see is in a powerful force around you, and if you see even the history of Ephesus itself, there are competing ideologies being presented. Paul's offering a different world. He's offering a different humanity, and for that church in Ephesus, he's offering a different form of covering.
So one of the things you focus on is the idea that the armor of God is the sort of the clothing of the high priest is what I took away from it. With the breastplate, with you even liken the helmet of salvation to the turban the priest wears, and the mark on the forehead. And I think you said in your introduction that's the point that James Jordan might disagree with. Do you want to talk a little about that? Where did that image come from, and why do you think that's the thing that the helmet is pointing to?
One of the things they didn't teach us in Sunday school, Rick, I suspect your Sunday school lessons and mine in northeastern Brazil, they didn't talk much about priestly turbans.
Right.
And there certainly weren't versions of your favorite Bible verse from Exodus 28 or Leviticus 9. And so in many ways, when the Apostle Paul is writing, he's writing he's writing in a sense of continuity with the world that he knows best.
Right.
And so the Apostle Paul, he is very self-aware that the world he knows best may be a bit foreign to those who he's addressing, but the world he knows best is the only true world that he can communicate. And so what the readers need to see, those who are reading this book and those who are familiar with the language of the Apostle Paul, because it is a very familiar piece of imagery that the Apostle talks about. What the people need to be aware of is that there is a history to what Paul is writing, that he's not writing out of nothing. He's not writing as if he is inventing things through the spiritual pen that the ink that he is using. The Apostle Paul is using a continual language of priesthood, which he, again, himself, not only Paul, but Peter, also uses in the New Testament writings. And so Paul wants to familiarize us with this priestly motif. And in the Old Testament scriptures, body language is used for all sorts of things. There is a significant emphasis placed on the feet, a significant emphasis placed on the hand. And certainly, I think the foremost interest the Bible has in the Old Testament is on the use of the head. We see this with the hair in terms of the Nazirite vows. We see this in the use of the forehead in terms of the priestly anointings. And so the head and the forehead in particular takes a significant emphasis. And so when Paul is talking about the helmet of salvation, Paul is assuming a language that is very familiar to the priestly motif. And what we see in Exodus 28 is that the entire consecration of a priest is rooted in this ritual, a form of baptism, which is an anointing that takes place. And that anointing is the thing, the ritual, the rite, we might say R-I-T-E, that sets the priest apart for a particular role. We can talk about that role a little bit later, but what he's being set apart for is he's being set apart for something that is holy, something that is noble, something that is protective by nature, and he's also being set apart to have access to a holy place, a holy sanctuary, to do things that he couldn't do before this anointing in the forehead took place. And that's very significant because when we begin to connect the history of the priestly ordination rite to what we see in the language of baptism, there is a clear parallel between these two languages. And I think that's what Paul is trying to, that is what he's connecting the reader to. And I think he develops that even more so, and so does Peter in First Peter 2 and First Peter 3. But he's developing this theme, and I think the baptismal language sort of emerges as, let me phrase it this way. Baptism begins on the head. That's where the covenant begins, and it goes all the way to the feet.
Right.
So baptism begins here in the helmet, and the feet is what takes the baptismal word to the world. So that's the Great Commission in essence. You're discipling on the basis of your baptism.
Right. Let's talk about that priestly commission a little bit. I'm preaching right now a sermon series on Samson, the life of Samson, and one thing that brings in is the Nazirite vow, the idea that Nazirites have a consecrated head and that they are warrior priests set aside to do the warfare of God's people, representing God's people. It seems like you pick up some similar themes with the idea of consecration as a priestly people. Often we think of the armor of God. We think of it as this individual battle. I'm having my internal battle with sin, which is true. We each have our individual battle with sin, but you really emphasize uh, the community, the priestly community of believers, that this isn't just one individual putting on the armor, but it's an army putting on the armor. How does that cause us to see that passage differently?
That's a great question. And I think the question usually arises because there is a particular way that evangelical Christians have interpreted Luther's doctrine of the priesthood of all believers that I think endangers the very fabric of reformational theology, but it has so permeated, Rick, the evangelical culture that when we talk about the priesthood of all believers, that's understood as me, Jesus, and my Bible in a relatively dark closet, not too dark because we can't read, but dark enough to just provide the kind of background ethos for our reading. If that's the case, then what Luther is arguing for is not very different than what the church of the day is arguing for in the 16th century, that we are self-created popes.
Mm-hmm.
So, even Rome had a more elaborate system than that. But in the Protestant case, if the priesthood of believers means we can self-appoint, then we're just perpetuating Rome, just in a cheesier, less sophisticated fashion with no hierarchy. But I think what Luther is saying, and this bears also in the language of the Confessions, what Luther is saying is that the priesthood of the believers is a priesthood unto others. We are, after all, a kingdom of priests unto God. So the priesthood of the believers can only be formed rightly when priests are together pursuing the call and the agenda that God has given. So if you take an individualized version of priesthood, what happens is you're fighting as a one-man army. And even Jesus himself, who fights for us, even Jesus himself becomes our leader in the army, but Jesus himself connects himself to a bride, to a royal priesthood. So even Jesus fights together with his bride. And so we need to be very cautious that we don't over-spiritualize the priesthood of the believer, because that's precisely when the danger takes place within the church, when people view themselves in this priesthood as isolated beings, divorced from authority, divorced from one another. That individualized priesthood is the kind of priesthood that I think the book of Hebrews warns against. And the book of Hebrews, specifically, most likely written by the Apostle Paul, is calling the people to a new priesthood, a priesthood that is no longer simply walking by sight, as so many were tempted to in the first century, but a priesthood that continues the priesthood of the old, walking together, ascending to the holy mountain together. That's the priesthood that is enduring. And the danger of abiding by other versions of priesthood is that other versions of priesthood are going to offer you a kind of an easy way out. But the holy priesthood offers you the way of longevity, which is always within the holy assembly.
Right. So in what context do we, as priests, fight the good fight? You mentioned in your book that it's not on Twitter that we're going to win the fight. That hurt a little bit. I felt it right here. Where do we fight? Where is the warfare, and where do we win?
That needs to be brought into a into a list of priorities, because we're fighting in various different spheres. There are different layers of this fight. The battle is great. The battle encompasses all sorts of things, all sorts of places. Paul talks about principalities and powers. Those principalities and powers can go as far as Anthony Fauci, and as low as the guy who is mocking your faith at work. And it can also be in even within the assembly with false teachers that Paul is also attacking. So there are different layers, and we all need to understand that God doesn't call all of us to one thing, or he calls us using our particular gifts to fight different battles in different places. You know, in the congregation there in Lynchburg, my congregation here in Pensacola, the members are given different gifts and they fight different battles. But if you put that as if you put this from a bigger perspective, an eagle's eye perspective, what you're going to see is that the way God looks at the central sphere of warfare is that central sphere must begin by protecting the thing that the priests did in Exodus and in Leviticus, by protecting the holy place. That holy place for us in the new covenant is the church of Jesus Christ. That holy place is the place where the Apostle Paul addresses the church at Ephesus, the church in Rome, the church in Laodicea that we see in Revelation chapter 3. That is the place where the war is most deeply fought. And that is also the place that teaches us how to fight. So that if we do that central task of worship poorly, we will fight poorly. Now, how does that happen? It happens when the people of God come together. They come together to worship the triune God, and they come together to affirm that they all have the helmet of salvation, their baptisms, and that the helmet of salvation from head to toe is renewed each time we gather. And when we gather, God is saying, you don't need to renew just one thing, but you need to renew the totality of your armor, because there are certain armor pieces that will be tempted to give out or to give in by the temptations of this world. And so we might even say, I don't mind if the breastplate of righteousness, I don't mind if there's just a little hole there. I don't mind if I'm only wearing one shoe as opposed to both. I don't mind if I begin to give in a little bit here. No, the worship motif, the worship theme calls us to renew the entire armor so that we can be presented as a living sacrifice unto God. If we think that all we need is 80% or 95% of the armor, we're going to realize very quickly that the devil is going to specialize. He's going to write a dissertation on that very point of weakness, and that is where Screwtape will attack the most.
You mentioned in your book, and the Apostle Paul makes it clear in Ephesians, that as far as being equipped and being dressed in your armor and how we equip each other, singing and music play a key role in that. Do you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yes, very happy to. This goes back to your first question, Rick, that one of the reasons we know that the Apostle Paul is talking about the priesthood is because the context of Ephesians chapter 6 is that the devil has schemes, and that the devil's constantly bringing his greatest hits to our attention. And his schemes and his traps are the kinds of things he's going to lay out for the Christian throughout his life. Well, in the Psalter and throughout the scriptures, but mainly the Psalter, we're singing about these entrapments. And we know that evil is trying to scheme against us. And the psalmist is always crying out, how long, O Lord, will they set trap against me? How long, O Lord, will they seek to destroy me? How long, O Lord, until the enemies stop mocking us, trying to remove our allegiance and trust in the God of our salvation? So Paul is borrowing, and interesting enough, we see this in Colossians, of course, but he's also in Ephesians 5, I think it's 5:19, where he says that we are to encourage one another with psalms and hymns and spirit songs. And I take that as a threefold reference to the structure of the Psalms, the 150 Psalms that we have as we look at our English Bibles, that Paul was essentially saying that the Psalter itself provides the fabric for how we are to understand our Christian warfare. And the more we sing them, the more we are encouraging one another to renew ourselves after that psalmic image we see in the Old Testament scriptures. Because the Psalms also provide the kinds of language, the language of grief, the language of jubilation, the language of turmoil, the language of persecution. The Psalms provide the language we need to understand our role as priests, which means that tell me what you sing and I'll tell you what you believe. And that's very significant for the Apostle Paul because he is hearing the songs of the Romans. And they have songs about conquerors, about conquest. They have songs about victory. They have songs about allegiance. They have songs about loyalty. They have songs about lordship. They have songs about commitment to the empire, commitment to a particular fight, a particular war. Well, Paul's presenting a different vision altogether. We have our own songs of conquest and victory and loyalty and allegiance to the empire, but it's very different than the empire that Rome is offering. And so I think the Apostle Paul wants us to push forth our baptismal callings by using our baptismal hymnody, which I believe is found very much centrally in the sacred scriptures in the Psalter.
Now, this is an aside, totally unrelated, but I know you're not an exclusive psalmody guy. What would you say to? I mean, I believe the Psalms are central to our worship and sort of the heart of what we sing in church. What would you say to someone with an exclusive psalmody position who says that's all we are allowed to sing, and we don't write any other songs?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the Psalms themselves encourage us to compose new songs. You know, I think that passages like Psalm 98, oh, sing a new song to the Lord. I think what he is establishing is a paradigm for compositions. And so, and the second thing I would say is that it would be a mistake to make that assertion because history testifies that many of the apostolic letters were written as small songs. Philippians 2 being the case, there's evidence of this in the book of Colossians as well. And the early church sang various portions of the Old Testament scriptures beyond the Psalms, like Isaiah 6 and things of that nature.
Right.
So we need to keep that in mind. But the argument I think I'm trying to make is that the Psalms are to be central, but they're not exclusive. They're central in setting the stage for how music ought to be composed. And so what they do is they establish the themes and the parameters for how music is to be composed. In other words, the Psalter is the inspiration for composition, not the sole source or not the only compositions. And so that's why the people of God for a very, very long time have composed music. If you look at people like Isaac Watts, the entirety of his hundreds and hundreds of compositions, you can see that they're very rooted and use the very language of the Psalter itself, because it was there where inspiration is found, but it was also there where we know for certainty that the inerrant words of God are also found.
Great. I want to circle back a little bit, jump subject, and circle back to Satan, because you were talking earlier about Satan and his schemes against the church, how he's going to come after and attack the church. And that's the context of Ephesians, that we're engaged as God's people in the singing, the speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, making melody in our hearts to the Lord. In your book, you talk about how one of the great problems in the modern church is that many people don't believe in a personal Satan. They don't believe that there is a being who is Satan, versus maybe just there's evil in the world generically. But the idea of a personal Satan and that there are real beings known as demons is important in our idea of spiritual warfare. Tell us a little about that.
Let me set the stage by saying that when the letter to the church at Ephesus was written, that particular church is living, let's say, at the end of the ages. They're not far from being, from in many ways being swallowed by that great historical event, which we see in AD 70, the destruction of the temple through and by the Roman armies, which is an interesting also play there. So if that's the stage there, they're living in a unique stage of history there in preparation for what's coming ahead. And I think it's important for us to know that when cataclysmic, apocalyptic events are coming in the stage of history, that the devil acts most antagonistically towards the faith, because he knows that his time is near, that he's being weakened, and so he's going to act the most, we might say, effectively. So we could say with a certain level of authority that the devil went to various places beyond Georgia, and he was also very much interested in the life of the church at Ephesus. And the evangelical fear, the evangelical timidity and allergy to the devil stems from the fact that there is a lack of interest in delving into the supernatural. And what the Apostle Paul was able to see was that above and beyond the common earthly, tangible wars that we fought against the Roman Empire, against Neronian figures, against wicked and unkind soldiers, against divisions within the early church, against all sorts of issues that happened within the early body. What Paul was able to see was he was able to see beyond the veil. He was able to see the war behind the war. And the war that Paul saw was a spiritual war. And that spiritual war with the principalities and powers led by the great serpent himself and his offspring, which served very much through political leaders and political empires. That war was guiding the earthly wars. So there was never a division of power. There was only a continuity of power. The heavenly wars were guiding the earthly wars. And that also happens for the church as well, that if the church begins to trust in earthly princes, earthly chariots, earthly horses, she's going to lose. The church needs to be guided by the one who fought the devil in the wilderness and who became the true second Adam, who took upon himself the war of Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and he was able to reframe that war in a way that only the true Adam could, and that the very temptations that Adam received in Genesis 3 were the same temptations that Jesus received in the mountain in his Lenten trials. The first Adam failed, the second Adam succeeded, and therefore establishing once and for all that not only is the devil real, but there's someone greater than the devil who is able to bind evil itself.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on and talking about your book, Uri. It's been a good conversation, and I hope people will buy it and read it because I thought it was really good. Good devotional material too, as well as sort of the theological structure. I think it really does give some good stuff for a Christian to chew on. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Rick. The Lord bless you, brother.
All right, you too. And thanks for tuning in and watching. I'm going to put a link to Uri's book in the description, and I'll see you next time.